Hello, welcome. Okay. Welcome, everyone. If you would go ahead and come in and take your seats. We have the honor today of the very Reverend Dr. Ian Markham, who's well known to all of us and a very wild favorite amongst our lineup. Every time he comes, several of you take me aside and say, wow, we really like it when he comes. Can he come more often? So this will be our last chance with him for the next year, because we will not be having our forum starting in January, because this room will be suddenly converted into multiple Sunday school classrooms when we start the renovation over in the parish hall. So I'm saying that so that you can savor this opportunity doubly. And our topic for this morning kind of fits the theme of today, and forgive us our debts, on sin, shortfall, and our shared need for grace. So please.
Thank you very much. There we go. It's lovely to be back with you again. Thank you very much for inviting me to come across the river. So I'm the Dean President of Virginia Theological Seminary, which is just literally in the wilds of Virginia. They do say the Potomac is that vast expanse that we fear to go across, both ways, incidentally. So I do invite you one day to make a journey, and in this Advent, our big thing is we have we've installed in our Welcome Centre an extraordinary exhibit. It's probably the finest St. Nicholas collection in the world. I mean, it's that dramatic. And so we have that, and then we have this extraordinary collection of creches. So if you want to prepare yourself for the holy season of Advent and Christmas, come across. And as you know, as you can probably detect from my accent, I'm an Englishman by birth. I did become an American in 2010, just to reassure you all. I forswore potentates. I must admit, I wasn't sure what I was going to say until I got there, and I wasn't entirely sure what a potentate was. But I forswore it anyway. So I've done that bit just to reassure you all. But you know, given my background, inevitably, what do you do when you run an institution? You build a pub, of course. And so we have our very own English pub on the campus, open Tuesday to Saturday. It does the finest burger in Northern Virginia, and the pours are generous. So just watch what you consume. But it's so do that. Do come and look at our St. Nicholas collection. Bring a friend, a grandchild, a child, a complete stranger, and come across. So one of my things, I'm world famous amongst 6 people, is I start every lecture with a joke, right? That's one of my things. And so I thought, you know, this is Christ Church, Georgetown, so let's go for jokes that just demand a little bit of mental rigor. So don't worry, it's not that much rigor. Yes, that's right. So I love this one. I think it's so cute. 2 cats are swimming across the English Channel. One's called 1, 2, 3, and the other's called un, deux, trois. Which one wins and why? And obviously the answer is 1, 2, 3, but not because of my accent, because un, deux, trois, cat sank. I know. No, I agree. Okay, so count to 6 in German. Yeah, thank you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Except they don't actually pronounce sex as sex. But we'll ignore that little detail in that joke. Anyway, there you are. You've got your Thanksgiving jokes all prepared, right? So this is the gift of adult education. You have some Thanksgiving jokes you can share with the family. and they'll all groan too. Okay, so forgive us our debts on sin, shortfall, and our shared need for grace. And I do believe Frank Wade next week is talking about forgiveness, so I'm going to focus much, much more on the sin end of this equation. And there is a handout on your seats, so you can follow along. So the interesting thing about sin is actually it's good fun. Okay, that's the problem with sin, right? It's actually deeply attractive. When Christians talk about original sin, they mean that there is a propensity in all human beings towards egotism and selfishness. It's a universal trait, and it's because of its intrinsic attractiveness. And I think it's really important to start there, because if you want to understand the challenge of sin, it's not that it's icky and horrible, it's actually really nice. It's good fun. So let's start off with little sins we all commit. You know, if you have a choice of a new pair of shoes or giving your money to the poor, I mean, which one do you go for? I mean, you go for the new pair of shoes. Of course you do. Or is it just me? Okay, right? So we make those decisions all the time, don't we? You know, we make the decision that, and we rationalize these things. You know, I deserve it. It's my only indulgence. I want to look nice. I've got a job to do. I've got people to, you know, you create this rationale for why we need more things, you know, and we all do that. That's very easy. Or when it comes to gossip. Gossip's great. I mean, who doesn't love gossip? You know, there's something nice. It's especially nice if it's salacious and a little funny and you sort of disapprove. So we sort of enjoy a little bit of gossip. You know, that's something which is quite enjoyable. Even if it's not entirely the case, we don't tend to investigate or interrogate it too much. We just sort of trust the veracity of the report. We know this person. They learned it somehow. And we then sort of smile wryly and find ourselves sort of slightly amused and everything else. Or when a sibling or a friend or a neighbour or a parent says something that you take offence at. Do you know what they said to me? Oh, I've had it with them. I've just had it. That's it. I'm not going to ever talk to them again. You know, there's something quite good about that indignation, isn't there? It sort of bubbles up. You feel, yeah, this is right, appropriate. It's outrageous what they said. Forgiveness. You know, Jesus says, I love that moment in the Gospels when Jesus is telling people to forgive people. And Peter says, well, I assume you mean, what, 7 times? And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. I'm sort of with Peter. In fact, I must admit, I think 7's quite a lot. I would have said 2, you know, or 3. But really? You got to forgive indefinitely somebody who persistently wrongs you? Give me a break. It's a bit like the argument between Confucius and Jesus. That's always an interesting one when I'm teaching. So Confucius in the Analects. So Jesus, as you know, says, love your enemies. Okay, give us a break on that one. That's going to be real lift to love your enemies. Confucius, interestingly, doesn't say that. He actually says, be fair to your enemies, and you don't love them because what do you do to your friends? It's a really interesting difference in the history of ideas. Most Christians live more like Confucians than they do Christians. We sort of think that's about right. You know, really? Loving your enemies? Give me a break. I mean, that's like ridiculous. They're mean to me. They're out to get me. They're out to take me down. Love them? No way. You know, we enjoy caricaturing others. We enjoy sort of having prejudices, and believe me, prejudice can take all forms. You know, we sort of like them. We like the sense it creates when we are with a group of people who share our prejudices. It's funny. You're making joke about whatever group you bond with and whatever group you have a problem with. You know, there's a nice bonding moment. Sin is very attractive. And that's the first and most important place to begin when you're thinking about sin. And the interesting thing about sin is it gets easier the more you do it. Okay, so in other words, you know, you discover that work you can claim as an expense something for yourself, okay? And you do it once, and because most institutions have complex financial systems and the amount's relatively small, it goes undetected. You sort of are worried the first time you abuse your expenses, but by the time you've done it 50 times, you're pretty mellow about it, actually, you know. So the first time one commits adultery, you go, oh, I feel a bit ashamed about that. And then when you've done it 50 times, you find it's pretty easy. And so the list goes on. So sin, you've got to understand, when you're talking about sin, you're not talking about something that is horrible at all, actually. Sin's a temptation because it's actually a very enjoyable state to be in. But, of course, and the but's massive, it is also deeply destructive. So why is it destructive? Because in the end, healthy relationships between people depend on integrity and authenticity and a regard for the other. Those three things: integrity, authenticity, and a regard for the other. So that's what healthy relationships depend upon. That's what, in a funny sort of way, Congress depends upon. That's what churches depend upon. That's what families depend upon. We depend on those three things. We need to bring our true self. That's authentic. Excuse me. We need to bring a self that is actually who we appear externally. We are in our inside life. The interesting thing about the Sermon on the Mount, so the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, just to remind you, Matthew's Gospel, first one in the New Testament, really interesting Gospel, because what Matthew did is he created 5 blocks of teaching. So he took the sayings of Jesus and plonked them all together in 5 distinctive blocks. And the reason why he did that is because he wanted anybody with a Jewish sensitivity to say, I'm in the presence of the new Torah, okay? Very brilliantly done. The first block of teaching is the famous Sermon on the Mount. And you'll remember, and it's worth just, perhaps as a little exercise running into Advent or Thanksgiving, just pause and read chapters 5-7. Just read them slowly. And you read them and you think, this is a ridiculous ethic. Again, Confucius is much more practical. I'm in danger of converting you all to Confucianism, so let me make it clear for the record, YouTube, I did not do that. I'm still an advocate of Christianity, but what Jesus is after there is really interesting. So he says, you've heard it said, do not kill, right? One of the 10 Commandments. But I say unto you, do not even get angry. So what's Jesus after there? Yeah, sure. Be a person who doesn't kill people. Yes, big tick. That's good. Not bad. Notice he's not saying it's bad. He's just saying do that. Yes, definitely. But also work on the drivers inside ourselves that make us want to have indulge in an act of animosity with another person. So try and integrate actions with heart, actions with mind. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say unto you, don't even turn another person into an object of sexual desire. So don't only just be a person who doesn't do the action, but also work on the interior life. So authenticity and integrity is a fundamental Christian aspiration, goal, telos. It's what it's in one very real sense all about. And the absurd thing about reading Jesus is you sit and think, this is outrageously demanding. Okay, Lord, this is like impossible. And in one sense it is. And we'll come to grace in just a moment. But yeah, that's a key idea. So sin's very attractive. We're called to be a person of integrity, so there is no duplicity. We are who we appear. That flows into authenticity. We are the real McCoy. I am Ian Markham. How I present is also who I am. There is no shadow story you can discover in my search engine in Google. Okay? It is weird, isn't it? We used to worry about God being the all-seeing eye. You say to children, don't forget God's watching you. I mean, it doesn't work anymore, But you know, that line doesn't work with children of Episcopal parents, parents who are Episcopalians, because, of course, they just turn and say, look, I know God's loving. God will give me a break. Oh, okay, we need more fundamentalism in the Episcopal Church. And bring back hell. Okay, right, so, but of course now you say, big tech is watching you. And then they get that immediately. Yeah, every keystroke on that keyboard, trust me, they go, whoa, yeah, good point. I need some VPN or something, you know, I need to make it appear as if I'm in London, not in Washington. You know, that's what you do when you want to circumvent. Yeah. This is turning into how to sin class. I've got to be really careful here. Right, so moving back to what we're focusing on. So authenticity, integrity. So sin's attractive, but it's destructive because the real you's not present in a place. I mean, the sad thing about the George Santos episode currently unfolding in Congress is assuming the veracity of the report, but there you see a clear conflict between the person presenting and the person who is, okay? And that, you know, but we all have it to different degrees. We all have that, let's admit that. We're all a version of that. God willing, you're not quite as distorted, but that's true of all of us. We're not living the Sermon on the Mount life, most of us. We have thoughts that we're very relieved people don't know about, right? So that's true of all of us. And then some people have thoughts and actions, which you hope others don't know about, you know, secret addiction to pornography on the web or whatever it is. So then you have that distance, and then it's a matter of degree. Okay, now, so why is this destructive? It's destructive because the gift of love is actually dependent on authenticity and integrity. So, you know, there's love to certain degrees, and love at its highest is love of the person who really is, right? And a focus on that person who really is. So that is what one aspires to. And of course, lives which lack love, in the end, become lonely and distorted and shallow and vulnerable and broken. In John's Gospel, the phrase eternal life is always present continuous, and eternal destruction, which is also a theme in John's Gospel, is also present continuous. So the idea in that Gospel is a life can start opening itself up to loving possibilities, and that then just continues into the life to come. So eternal life starts now and goes into life to come. Conversely, a life can become so distorted and fragmented and broken, that starts now and continues into the life to come. Hell is always self-inflicted. Hell's not a punishment by God. Hell is a human life making decisions to opt for egotism and selfishness consistently, and inauthenticity and a lack of integrity, and as a result, loneliness, because in the end it gets exposed. So hell starts with this shriveling up and then just continues into eternity. To use C.S. Lewis's great line, the gates of hell are always locked from Lewis, that God is always inviting people to move from selfishness to love and make that journey. So the whole great divorce novel is actually an exploration of purgatory, where you have to take a human soul and move it from selfishness into love. But that shift is painful, and because actually there's something quite nice about bickering and arguing, and of course he's got this lovely picture of hell, where you can just create a home by just projecting it, so it appears. But neighborhoods fragment rapidly, and people move further and further and further away from each other because of a perceived slight or an argument over a boundary, or they said something rude to me. So you have in Lewis a theology that actually we enjoy bickering, and we enjoy getting lonelier and lonelier and lonelier, even though in the end is the least enjoyable life possible. And if you're going to move from that selfishness into love, he documents it's going to be a painful process because you're going to have to change oneself significantly. And what's interesting about Lewis is his description of heaven is thin. It's like a couple of pages right at the end. Yeah, oh, come on. Really? You finished it there? And that speaks to some, sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole, but I'm quite enjoying it. That speaks to something quite interesting about Lewis. When Lewis wrote letters of what's it called? Screw tape letters. When he wrote the screw tape letters, he originally was going to write a comparable one from a junior angel to a senior angel. And then there's an exchange of correspondence where he explained why he didn't. And he said, I always found it easier to write from the perspective of the depraved than the virtuous. And I think I get that, actually. I can understand why that became a problem for him. So he never wrote the sister volume. Anyway, so, talk so far. Stage one, sin's attractive. And don't, if you know this, when somebody, normally it's a teenager, why is the world so difficult? Or 5-year-old. 5-year-old's the hardest. It's the 5-year-old who says, why are people mean to each other? The right answer is because actually we all enjoy being mean. The mystery of this world is not why there's so much violence and hatred and bigotry and prejudice, because just look inside. And then it's a question of degree and training and prayer and grace, how messed up we are. Okay, but it's destructive. It ends in loneliness. Okay, so what's our response? So the response is at the bottom of your sheet there, and I suggest 3 components: the alternative narrative, the power of our liturgy to bring about change, and the lifetime project of sanctification. Okay, so the alternative narrative. Do you know, I think one of the most absurd worldviews out there, which is manifestly problematic, is the view of secular humanism or atheism that asserts, in the end, all there is material, atoms, and all we are complicated bundles of atoms that emerge from nowhere and is going nowhere. I think that's just utterly ridiculous worldview. The interesting thing about conversations with people who are skeptical about the faith is, they spend all their time, chipping away. What about the problem of evil? How do you explain prayer? Why are you telling God stuff that God already knows? And won't God just do the right thing anyway? And the whole thing's just ridiculous. Jesus dying on the cross, a son. How does that make any difference to my sin? And they rattle off all these objections to the faith. And we don't get the chance to turn around and say, okay, all right. Now let's just talk about your worldview for a second. Are you seriously telling me all we are complicated bundles of atoms that emerge from nowhere and going nowhere? And if so, why are people significant? And if so, how do you make sense of music and love and art? And if so, really consciousness? I always think it's interesting that the French physicist who said to Napoleon, I have no need of that hypothesis of God. Oh, do you know, when I was young, I could remember stuff. But I looked in the mirror recently and I noticed I had grey hair. And I thought, yeah, you're officially old. It's that moment when you look and see your dad. You go, oh, yeah, I remember that look. Good heavens, when did that creep up on me? Anyway, it'll come to me in a minute. But he took the view, he was a classic atheist, and he took the view that if he knew the atomic configuration of the universe at the start of time, because he held a mechanistic causal view of the universe, he could then predict every single thing that subsequently happened, including this moment. Give me a break. That's just bonkers. You know, Beethoven's Fifth, Shakespeare's plays, all being predictable from a configuration of atoms at the start of the universe. This is a very implausible worldview. It just doesn't make sense. And there's no atheist I've ever met who really lives their life believing we're just complicated bundles of atoms. If you suddenly say to him, okay, how do you explain love? The love you have for that person in your life. They don't live as if they think we're just complicated bundles of atoms. They don't. They need to face up to the fact they're not living their worldview. The only person who came closest to it in the history of ideas is Nietzsche. But he went crazy. So it's not surprising. So, the alternative narrative that Christians want to affirm is this. At the heart of the universe is goodness and love, enabling everything that is and sustaining everything that is. That's what we mean when we say we believe in God. That's what you say when you say the creed. At the heart of the universe is goodness and love, enabling everything that is and sustaining everything that is. It's in the nature of love to want to create more loving possibilities. That's one of the lovely things about couples. They fall in love and they think, oh, it'd be nice to have more loving possibilities in the universe, and you end up, children pop out. You then sort of regret the expense, and the but it's also the greatest thing that can ever happen to you. Okay, so God, in the same way, over 13.7 billion years, started a process to create more loving possibilities in this universe. And therefore, the reason for being is love, and the goal of being is love. Right? That's it, really. And therefore, the task of life and living is to learn how to be loving. And that's the alternative narrative we set against sin. And we do so recognizing that sin's very attractive. It's a temptation. It is a temptation. It's a very attractive temptation, which we've constantly got to be alert to and in conversation with ourselves as we think a little bit about how we relate to this temptation. Now, you're all Episcopalians. Yay. One way to interpret our liturgy is that it's an exercise in confronting sin. So, the strength of the liturgical traditions, of course, is that, first of all, the prayers are extraordinary. I mean, Cranmer's prayer right at the beginning of the Eucharistic service is just an extraordinary prayer. Originally, actually, he had the priests say it themselves. And then slowly it was introduced a liturgy that we all say that prayer. And it's just a beautiful prayer. And you know, the purpose of a liturgy, C.S. Lewis, he's popping up a lot today, said, you know, the thing about liturgy is the first few times you're acquainting yourself with it, it's sort of strange. But slowly, it's like a new shoe that initially you feel all the pinch points and the pain, but slowly your foot becomes accustomed to it, and you think less about the shoes and more about walking. So by analogy, a liturgical experience initially is just a pain. Do I sit? Do I stand? It's like aerobics. You know, some people stand, some people sit. What do I do after the Sanctus and Benedictus? Do I sit? Other people sit. Some people kneel. You know, so of course it's puzzling. But slowly, as you get used to it and learn it, it starts becoming the vehicle it's intended to be. And a lot of liturgy works subconsciously, so you don't notice it's working. But there are three crucial moments when you're facing sin in the liturgy. The first, of course, is the confession. And it's a great confession, pretty comprehensive. You know, it's things you've done, right? Where you've just been selfish or egotistical or inconsiderate or unkind or thoughtless. Things you've done, things you've left undone. I love that. You know, I really should have done this. I needed to reach out to that person. I should have made that phone call. I should have sent some flowers. I should have sent that note. Whatever it is. And then, you know, you just say that things, my interior life as well as my exterior life's there. You know, things I've thought as well as things I've said. So it's pretty comprehensive. And what you're doing at that moment is you're saying, okay, I'm in a system I do know my favorite biblical metaphor is the potter and the clay. It pops up in Jeremiah and in Isaiah, and then, of course, it's used by Paul in Romans. And it's a lovely model because I like that. I like the fact that, you've seen people, normally you see them at places like Monticello and things like that. You see a potter working the clay, and you watch them as they make a mistake and then change it. I love that. It's a very gradual process, trying to get me right. I know I'm a mess. I'm a lump of clay. I don't mind that. That sums me up, really. And then God's going to try and create something beautiful out of me. Okay, so in the confession, you're saying, okay, I'm a lump of clay. I'm a broken person. I'm still messed up. I'm nowhere near the standard of the Sermon on the Mount. I have more sympathies in practice with Confucius than I have with Jesus, but I'm working on that, Lord, and I bring my brokenness to you. The second moment's the peace. Now, a lot of Episcopalians don't realize that peace is supposed to be doing some work. That's because it feels like the seventh inning shuffle, doesn't it, really? You're at a baseball game, you need a stretch, we used to shake hands before COVID, but now, of course, most people bow and nod. What's the practice here? Are you shaking hands? Pretty mild. Good. Good heavens. Lordy. Okay, right. So this is a very progressive ecclesial community. You probably haven't been told that recently, have you? You get to the peace. Now, the interesting thing liturgically about the peace is it comes before the offering. So there's an echo immediately, again in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, do you remember the story? Jesus says, before you make your offering to God in the temple, go and be at peace with your brother. It's a really interesting moment. There are a couple of things going on there. Firstly, giving is a privilege, right? I know we think we're doing the church a big favor when we honor our pledge, but actually, theologically, you're reminding yourself, look, every second of every day, I'm given the gift of breathing, seeing, looking, laughing, and living. And that is a gift. It's a fragile gift, it's an extraordinary privilege, it's a miracle. And therefore, I'm just making a very modest gift back to the God who enables me to be. Right? So that's actually the work of the offering. But God actually says, I don't want your offering yet. I want to make sure that all those who've hurt you, you are now at peace with. Right? Now that's jolly tricky. Because, of course, the weird thing about us not being at peace with people who've hurt us is we can carry it for years. It can be a parent who neglected us. It can be the spouse and relationship that broke down. It can be the person who didn't promote us at work. It can be the friend who really hurt us and didn't realize that he had done so. And sometimes this is going back a long time. I sometimes think theologically what we should do at that point is we should hand out cell phones to every single person. And you say to them, okay, I want you to call up the person who's hurt you most this week. And I want you to say, I've got to a point in the service when I've got to say to you, the peace of the Lord. That I'm really hurt by a father who was absent, or whatever it is, the spouse who left me, or whatever it is, the sibling who hurt me, or whatever it is, the relationship that broke down, or whatever it is, the employer who was cruel to you, or whatever it is, I just now need to say, okay, the peace of the Lord needs to come into that space. Why? Because the weird thing about being hurt is most of the time they're fine. They've gone off. They're sorted. That's a weird thing. As an agent of sin, it's sometimes easier to be that than a victim of sin. That person's come to terms with it, doesn't think about it anymore, and they're having a whale of time. So there we are living with the shadow of the pain, which is impacting the present and messing up the future. Because, of course, the way all this works, just basic psychology, is that the shadow of the past impacts the present and damages our relationships in the present and potentially into the future. Because we're all, Augustine spotted it first, and then Freud, it's interesting, those two great minds spotted that iceberg underneath the conscious mind that actually is impacting a whole host of our relationships without even having any understanding. So we all go into therapy to try and learn something about the iceberg. And that's how it all works. So letting the peace of the Lord into those painful places is really important. The third moment when you deal with sin is actually in the fraction. The Christian, and this is where we touch finally on grace. So the fraction is the bit in the service you hardly notice really, but it's an interesting thing if you're following along in the Book of Common Prayer. So, you've had the peace, the table's set, you have the great thanksgiving. Funny name for a prayer, incidentally. Thanksgiving. I mean, after getting over some preliminaries about creation and the fact that God's worked so hard to disclose the revelation of God through Abraham and the patriarchs and the prophets, and up pops Jesus, the focus, of course, on the Great Thanksgiving is this guy dying, and you're sort of reenacting his last meal. Gross, okay, but so it's a great Thanksgiving for tragedy, actually. And then you have the Lord's Prayer, and the fraction is literally that moment right after the Lord's Prayer. So if you read the rubric, and I tell my students, look, this is really important, you stop and pause there, even if it feels awkward. What it actually says is the hostess is broken. And it says silence will be kept. So it's not may. There are lots of rubrics which are mays, but that one will be. And of course, it's only a moment before the organist starts playing the fraction anthem or, the words are uttered. But of course, you have the symbolism then of grace can be found even through sin. I mean, in one sense, the redemption story is all about an occupying power of the Romans taking this Jewish guy, torturing him, killing him, and yet, in that horrendous act of sinfulness, the redemption of the world's possible. Weird or what? But that's the claim. And so there is grace found through the sin. That leads to the third point on the sheet, and that is, the interesting thing then is that I grew up Baptist. I grew up, actually, before that, very weird, and then Baptist. And then I became an Anglican in England. But the interesting thing, of course, as a teenager, I used to go to these renewal. I used to set up a tent in the town. I used to go along. And, there you are, you're 11. And when you're challenged by the preacher, anybody sinful come forward to give your life to Jesus? I used to go through pretty regularly, just to make sure I was really saved. And because, you're a guilt-tormented teenager, so you've got plenty of things you feel you deserve hell for. So you walk forward repeatedly. And of course, but the theology behind that I've always thought very problematic. I remember thinking this then. There's something weird about imagining all you have to do is give your life to Jesus and everything just changes. And the reason why I like the potter and the clay image is because that's not the assumption. The potter doesn't just pick up a slab of clay and it suddenly becomes beautiful. It's going to be a lot of work, sometimes hours. And sometimes you make a mistake. And you have to sort of start over. I love that. And the great thing about the Episcopal Church is you have repeated altar calls, every week. And of course, the theology of the sacraments, probably in Christ Church, I need to check with your rector, but I'll go for it, is actually a fairly high sacramentality. Is that true? So in other words, and talk to anybody on the altar guild, you treat very respectfully consecrated elements, the bread and the wine. Why? Because you're in a parish which believes that when you start that service, it is just bread and wine. And then what happens is you pray the prayer to the Father. So remember, the image of Father in our theology is Genesis, origin, creator. To enable the Holy Spirit, so the image of Holy Spirit is connector, glue, is the agent that actually interacts with us all the time, the aspect of God that touches us and brings about any change in the world. To enable the eternal Word, the Son, right? That's what the metaphor Son means. It means literally resemblance of God, ways of knowing about my thoughts. You know, if you meet Luke, my 26-year-old son, he resembles me in all sorts of ways, right? Because that's biology. Okay, so Jesus is the disclosure of God, the eternal Word. So what happens in that prayer is you ask the source to send the Spirit to enable the eternal Word to be present in the elements as the eternal Word was in the body of Jesus. And then when you step forward to receive the elements, you receive something of the divine life in you that becomes a resource to enable us to start living the divine life that God intends for us for eternity. And that's the theory. And the thing to do is come each week. Because sure, you'll leave, and all the things you're carrying, all the baggage, will still be with you. You'll work, God willing, on an area. You'll be more attentive to this or that person's needs. You'll try and have a more constructive attitude to that person in your past. You'll make an overture to somebody who you know is mad with you. Whatever it is, you'll make those decisions, but you'll still have tons of baggage. And so you return next Sunday, and you go the whole thing again. You'll confess, you'll exchange the peace, you'll hear the words of the fraction, and you'll receive the sacrament. And slowly, possibly over a decade, somebody will say, I'm really pleased you're you, because you're making a difference in my life. And for that, I'm really grateful. Well, that's it. I finished. I got to the bottom of my handout.
Not that easily, Emily.
Oh, right, sorry. Not that easily.
Those who would like to extend the conversation and extract more wisdom. Questions, anyone?
A Presbyterian snuck in here when you weren't looking. Could you give a quick thought on the difference between debts and debtors and trespasses, and those who trespass against us? As a Presbyterian, I'm advised debtors is the more accurate translation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. So in brief, so Presbyterians say debt and debtors, and Episcopalians say trespass and trespasses. Now, I would have to check the genesis and origin of all this. My guess is that this goes back to, Old English, and the Cranmer Book of Common Prayer and its translation is responsible for trespass and trespasses. The terminology, so you'll see in the Book of Common Prayer that we now have, our modern rendering is, I think, even better again. Sins and forgive us our sins as those who sin against us is actually the new wording, and I think that's where it should be. The most problematic line actually in the Lord's Prayer in terms of translations, the next one, temptation, because that's got a whole set of connotations which was never intended in the Greek. But yeah, I think if I had to rank them in terms of clarity, I would say sin's best, debtors second, and trespasses third. Trespasses, I would need to check this, but my guess is it's got its origins in probably 18th century or even 17th century English, when that did carry connotations of somebody Linguistically, of course, it's evolved into trespassing means you're on my property. So it is that sense of violation of what God intended is probably the etymological root. But I agree with you. It's a very misleading term. Although, whenever I'm saying the Lord's Prayer for myself, I always use the traditional form. It's just inside me. And although at the seminary we quite often use the modern for these reasons, you're actually saying what Jesus intended and you're using words that people understand, which are two good reasons. I always find myself having to really concentrate when I say that version of the prayer to make sure I get it right. Yes, please.
I just came up with this image as you were talking. So we have goodness, and then we have Lucifer, who was a rebel. And I think rebellion is a great part of what you were talking about. All right, so Lucifer is kicked out of heaven. He begins to drift downward. And temporarily, we hit the sandbar of C.S. Lewis, who felt that God didn't send people to hell. They just evaporated. So we move on from that. Lucifer continues down, and now we have this vast conflagration, which to me is like what's going on in the world today. So two things. The genuine evil in the world today perhaps comes from rebelliousness. Also gives us climate warming. Now you're supposed to laugh. And then I took your image of the powder and the clay, and I'd never thought about this before. One thing they don't talk about in that is the kiln. So this molded clay goes into the kiln, which is the world.
Right, yeah.
And it sometimes fails. And so that's the kiln is the world. And I think then that the image of forgiveness and grace can even be a recognition that even in God's careful creations, there can be a problem.
Yeah, no, I love all that. I think that's really you can easily get some sort of AI algorithm to tell you every single day that it loves you. But there's a world of difference between that and having a kid say that they love you. So you do need genuine freedom to be able to exercise love. So God had to build that into the system. And then we choose egoism over dependence. So, the weird thing about being human and rebelling is when you think about it, it's really stupid. It's non-rational because, of course, we're dependent totally on God for our existence. Every second of every moment is enabled by the Creator. And who we are is enabled by the Creator, the capacity to think and reason and laugh and live and love. So that's enabled by the Creator, and yet we're turning around to the source of everything and saying, I want to live differently. And that's a classic hubris. Pride is considered one of the foundational sins because it's an act of rebellion against the Creator and a refusal to acknowledge what must be true, and that is we're highly dependent on every single moment of every single second on the grace of the Creator to enable us to be. So I think rebelliousness is actually a very key idea, and I agree with that. I also think the way you develop the image of the potter is really intriguing as well. So that image is found in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. When Bible references, I always tell the students, I'm within 3 chapters. So I sort of make it up. Yeah, go on.
First of all, I don't like to think of God as someone who would be angry at people through eternity. And therefore, I like to think of hell as Lucifer's creation.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I agree with you. I don't think God's angry actually with anybody, right? I don't think God is angry with anybody, is the position I take. I think what happens is people exercise their freedom and choose to live lives of rebellion and self-destructiveness. And I agree with you that in the end...
And it also has created climate warming.
Right, so that one I'm staying away from just for the moment, because... But I do think that, I think that's helpful. And I do think that it's The interesting thing about sin is that it can become habitual. And depravity is when you've lost any sense of moral moorings. You know, interestingly, it's potentially psychotic. So the habitual nature of it's become so deep-seated that you almost have no human agency or control over it. And certainly if you look at some of the most war-torn parts of the world, the deep sadness there is an environment's emerging where human life is cheap, where acts of kindness are few, and where evil things are commonplace. And then you have a culture of habitual sin. And that's very scary. That's very scary.
May I bring one more question?
Yes.
I love the way you sort of compared the contrasting narratives of a secular view where we're just us and everything can be explained, and of a Christian narrative where we're the product of love and we're made for love. As fallen beings or finite beings who have bought into that narrative of love and are seeking to live in it and yet still experience the pull of sin. Can you comment just a little bit on those moments where it's not that we want to choose that, but we find ourselves doing it anyways, and especially as we're approaching grace, approaching Eucharist, and feeling that, oh my goodness, that's what I did, and facing it again, how we grapple with being able to receive something that we're so very aware of our undeserving of.
Yeah. So I'm a great fan of be gentle with yourselves as a mantra. I might have it on my tombstone. And the reason why I'm a great fan of that is because, here's the paradox of the Gospels. The Gospels are probably what's called Greco-Roman biographies, right? For a long time, when I went through university and seminary, not that I did seminary, I did something different, but we'll ignore that detail. I was taught that they were unique and distinctive genres and not to be confused with biographies. And that's because the word biography has a whole set of post-Freudian connotations, that it's an exploration of the interior life of a person, what motivates them, who they are, what made them famous, and then around that you hook the chronology of a life. And so we were all taught they weren't biographies. But then a classicist came along called Richard Burridge, and he actually compared them with Greco-Roman biographies and said, this fits right in with that genre. So stop thinking modern biographies, think of Greco-Roman biographies. And Greco-Roman biographies are really interesting. What a Greco-Roman biography does is it invites you to look at the words and deeds of the hero, at their attitude to death. And that's the reason why the Gospels actually are like almost half, 50%, 40%, 50% preoccupied with the last week of Jesus' life. So they're Greco-Roman biographies. Now the thing about the Gospels then, and here's the weirdest thing. At the beginning of Luke says, I've already talked, in the beginning of Acts, Luke says, I've already talked about the words and deeds of Jesus of Nazareth. So when you interpret the Gospels, you're supposed to be looking at both the words and the deeds. And the big takeaway, which gives me joy all the time, is that the words of Jesus are impossible. You know, go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Do not lust. Do not get angry. Forgive 70 times 70. Give me a break. I mean, these are like really demanding expectations. But the deeds of Jesus are, they never give up on anybody. The interesting thing about Jesus is Jesus got a reputation for hanging out with all the people that you shouldn't hang out with. The people who were most clearly, furthest away from the ethic he was preaching. So you have the paradox of a demanding ethic and the promise that God doesn't give up on us. Now that doesn't mean that we say, oh good, yes, I'll carry on being depraved and I'm still accepted by God. That's not the takeaway, let me just stress, coming back to your question. The takeaway is every single time you come forward to receive the Eucharist, sure, you're conscious of your brokenness before God. You're conscious of the fact that the ethic we're called to live and invited to live, and we want to live, we're not succeeding in doing so, and that we're broken and we're frail. But you also come knowing that the God who gives you that Eucharist is the God who received you, wraps an arm around each and every one of us and reassures us that we're loved. And sends you out to work on that broken relationship, to concentrate a little bit on the unhealthy habit, to think afresh about our ethics in respect to expenses, to be a little kinder and a little more generous in our spending decisions, whatever it is. But God never gives up on us is a key. So the way to interpret the Gospels, so it's really interesting, isn't it, in church? In liturgy, you talk about 3 words in the service. There are 3 words operating. There's the written word, which is the text of Scripture. There's the eternal word, which is the disclosure of God in the Gospels. And then there's the proclaimed word, when the poor preacher has to connect the written and the eternal with the moment. Okay, so that's how it's supposed to work. And when you think about it in terms of posture, we sit for the written word. So we listen to the Old Testament lesson and to the epistle. And then, of course, you stand for the gospel, the eternal word, and often it's read from the midst of the people because the gospel comes to us, the good news is coming to us. And then you sit for this poor preacher to connect those 2 things with the world in which we live, right? So that's the drama that's unfolding then. And therefore, in Anglican theology, the primary disclosure of God's actually the eternal word. So if you ask the question, if somebody says to you, how do you know what God's like? Your answer is, Jesus is my epistemology. It's a great answer anyway, because it throws them to hear the word epistemology being used. So epistemology, just to remind you all, is your theory of knowledge. So how do you know what God's like? You know because we believe in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. You see the very thought of God embodied, because that's what a word is. This morning I had a banana and Weetabix for breakfast. I've uttered words. You now have a picture of a rather gross breakfast cereal with a diced banana in it, okay? Words tell you my thoughts. That's how it all works. Jesus is the very thought of God embodied. What do we learn of Jesus? We learn that Jesus, in Jesus' words, is calling us to a really demanding ethic of selflessness, other-orientated, generosity, forgiveness, an interior life compatible with the exterior life, a really demanding ethic. But we learn also the very thought of God embodied teaches us that the God we worship is a potter working on clay, and it might take, in the case of Ian Markham, a really long time. And I say thank you every Sunday, and that's the theory.
The theory and the lived reality.
God,
Thank you for
God
being
willing.
you.
Thank you. Thank Thank you very much. Thank